Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Richard Allen Turner. I'm a board-certified pediatrician. Welcome to my channel, Kids Info Network Dayton. I hope you enjoy the show. Focus Kids is coming right up. Talk about the concept of mismatch repair. But first, this may be a good point to talk just a little bit about biology, specifically the human stress response, the autonomic nervous system, the fight or flight versus the rest and digest, feeling safe, sympathetic versus parasympathetic system. And we used to think that there were just the two kind of simple systems, but we now know that there are actually three, one in the sympathetic and two in the parasympathetic. Dr. Gold, can you talk about what happens to our body when the sympathetic fight or flight system is activated, short-term and chronically?
Sure. I'm going to ask you a question first, though, because when you say we now know that there are three ways, I'm curious, did you learn that in your medical training?
No. I learned that from the book.
I just really want to highlight that because I think that
I had never heard of the smart vagus versus the primitive vagus. No, I learned that from the book. So I should have said, now I know.
Because it's really important because it has, for me, professionally, it has such an enormous impact. So the kind of classic bear in the woods is this fight-flight response. That you have a frightening experience and you have a choice, which is to fight or run away. And that's mediated by the sympathetic nervous system that gets your heart rate going, gets your legs moving, and it serves a protective function. But the problem is if you're constantly feeling in a state of having a bear in your house, let's say, your body is flooded with stress hormones, which is not good for your brain or any organs of your body. And then if you like, I can talk about how the parasympathetic system offers a different way to understand threat, but I'll follow your lead where you want me to go with that.
Go right ahead. Yeah, that's not in my questions, but that's fascinating.
Learned about Dr. Porges's work was that there's a whole other way we make meaning of our world that's not the sympathetic system. So we can either feel safe and engaged, but when we feel overwhelmed, then we shut down. I mean, it's what we think of as dissociation, and we can't even take in. So this is the situation that happens often in the clinical setting, where a fight-flight is not an option. You're upset, you can't, punch your therapist or run out the door. You have to sit there and you're very threatened by the idea of talking about your child who's got whatever kinds of problems. So your primitive vagus kicks in. So you sit there and the person talks to you and your face is kind of flat and you're not really processing. You're physically in the room, but you're really, your primitive vagus is kind of protecting you from really being there. And that's why often parents don't take in what we say to them. So when you are with a family, if you can really take the time and create a safe space, then you allow their smart vagus to come online, and then you can have a much more meaningful interaction.
So maybe to put it in layman's terms, it's the la 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 mode.
Yes, that's good.
Okay.
Or another version, which may not, well, I think is layman's term, is that when you're under really high levels of stress, your cortical areas, your higher cognitive areas, the areas that allow you to reflect on things and to think about things, are actually being shut down. that they're actually not receiving the blood supply and the energy that they need. So you're really unable, in some sense, to think. And that stress, for a parent dealing with what Claudia has said, dealing with a parent who's hearing some kind of problematic news about a parent, well, they're in some sense really lit up, but they're not lit up in the cognitive areas. They're lit up in the emotional areas, and it's hard to take in all of that information and to reflect on it.
Okay. And Dr. Tronick, let's talk about stress reactions. Positive, tolerable, and toxic stress, which you so eloquently describe as the good, the bad, and the ugly, which I like a lot better than positive, tolerable, and toxic. I like very simple terms, and that is done beautifully. Can you describe each of these, and what are the effects of each?
I came to the idea about the good, the bad, and the ugly, aside from having watched Clint Eastwood, maybe to too much of an extent during my own development. But the good interactions were what I was trying to understand about infant social emotional capacities, interactions where the parent and the infant are playing with one another, where they're exchanging information. And it's, to choose a word that or a phrase, it's a good enough interaction. It's one where a connection is made and then it's kind of broken, and there's a bit of a mismatching, but there are what we'll talk about in terms of repairs. The ugly interactions are ones where there's a mismatch between what's going on between the parent and the infant, and it just lasts too long. It exceeds the infant's capacity to deal with the break in the connection that's going on with the parent. And the ugly ones are the ones that we talk about in terms of things like neglect or abuse, where in neglect you're having probably prolonged mismatches, and the infant is, in a sense, left alone and disconnected for long periods of time, and is unable to keep themselves calm, and is unable to feel safe because they're not getting the support that they need. And of course, in more abusive situations, the infant is actually being frightened and getting disrupted by the kind of interaction that's taking place.
And the still face that we watched earlier in the show, that's an example of the bad, correct?
Right. The still face, you could think about the still face as one this very acute, unusual event, and it lasts 2 minutes. But what happens if you begin to think, what happens if there were still faces regularly occurring over the course of the day for the infant? Or a still face that lasts for, I don't know, I've never done it, but for something like 20 minutes. That would lead, you were talking about the autonomic nervous system, that would lead to a really big disruption in the autonomic nervous system. And it would exceed the infant's capacity to cope with what's going on. In the book, we quote something from Winnicott, where he talks about the infant can tolerate the parent coming and going maybe for a minute or 2 minutes or whatever, 5 minutes. But what happens when the parent is really unavailable for long periods of time, and that long period of time exceeds the infant's capacity to take care of themselves, to self-regulate. And so then they become distressed, and the distress becomes a really costly, stressful state for the infant.
What happens if the time between mismatch and repair is actually reduced to 0 in either one? This is for either one of you.
I guess in that situation where you have an anxious, intrusive caregiver who can't tolerate any mismatch, who feels that they have to be perfectly available to their children all the time. This is actually a quite common occurrence. And then if you think about how the child develops their sense of themselves as a separate person through these moments of mismatch and repair, that it really can get in the way of the child's developing their own self-regulatory capacities, because they never have the experience of having to do it on their own. But it's all this idea has to be understood in developmental context, because what's too long for a 3-day-old is different from what's too long for a 3-year-old, or even a 3-week-old. The optimal time is related to the baby's ability, according to their developmental stage, to manage themselves without their caregiver.
And I think this is a perfect segue to our next topic, mismatch repair. Dr. Tronick or Dr. Gold, can either of you describe the concept of mismatch repair? What is it? What's its importance in relationships?
I came to that context, or that concept, in having worked on face-to-face interactions. And at the time that we were first working on them, we had this model of the interaction between a parent and the infant that kind of mimicked Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, that you were perfectly attuned to one another. All the emotions were positive, and it was a kind of perfect dance that was going on. Now, what's amazing about that is, of course, we were looking at real interactions. We were videotaping them. And you could see that the interactions weren't always coordinated. Parents and infants were not always doing the same thing together. The infant would look off to the side, or the mother would pick something up, or the baby would frown and start looking at objects in the world. Nonetheless, the objective scientists, still argued that synchrony was the way interactions were, that they were really positive. But finally, when I looked at the data that we were collecting, we were coding mother's behavior. Was she smiling? Was she looking at the infant? Was she frowning? What was the baby doing? The baby was smiling, frowning. And we were looking to see how much time they were doing the same thing together. And there in the data, we did graphs and lots of statistics, but just staring us in the face was this phenomenon that for short periods of time, there was a matching between what the mother was doing with the infant and the infant was doing with mother. And then there were these periods of time where one or the other or both of them were pretty much doing something else, that they weren't matching what was going on. So I began to see that the interaction was one of this process of matching, mismatching, going back and forth between them. So it was really something that came out of the research that we were doing, but it had to slam me in the face in order for me to see what was going on.
Dr. Gold, what does good mismatch repair do for infant development? What does it teach infants from the very start?
Well, I think you see in the still face that you showed at the beginning that the baby has this kind of sense of hope and agency, that this is a terrible situation, but I have all these things I can do to get you back. Now, the baby didn't read that in a book. The baby learned that through their moment-to-moment interactions up to this point in their life, that things will go wrong and that they'll get back together again. So if you have that kind of optimal mismatch and repair, where it's not too much for the baby to handle and it's not too little and it's not limited by the intrusive caregiver, then the baby develops their own sense of competence and sense of sort of positive way of being in the world.
Describe for our viewers what you mean by agency in the context of relationships that you're using it in.
That I have the ability to act on my world to change it. And that's really a hope. That's really kind of like the definition of hope. I think the two words are very closely related. That you have a sense of yourself as having the ability to act in a way that changes your circumstances.
And how do you discuss mismatch repair with parents? What is your approach to that?
Well, we use the word messy a lot in the book, and I think that's I use that word clinically a lot. So, for example, I just had a visit with a family where there was a new baby born to a family with an older boy who's almost 5. The dad works very long hours, and you kind of add COVID onto that, and the whole transition in a very typical way to having a second child was very, very messy. And they've struggled quite a bit. And so, but so I use that context, like that's what it is. And that's kind of a healthy thing for a family to be disorganized in that way and not to resist it and not to expect that everything is going to be smooth and easy. And then now, once I kind of use that language, they see that now that the baby is 4 months old, that they've really become a very different family unit. And in some ways, it's a much more complex and a more rich family unit. I mean, they're still on their way there, but they come to appreciate that out of that messiness and the moment-to-moment mismatch and repair, that they've really grown as a family.
So can mismatch repair kind of be thought of as mess it up and clean it up?
You could, yeah.
And it's fun to make a mess. Is that? Do you think that's fair, Dr. Tronick?
Well, I'm a little stunned by the phrasing, but I think it is accurate, and I think people, if they think about their relationships with their more intimate partners or with their friends, I think we can all begin to see that both at the micro level of just straight up, back and forth, that there are always these mismatches. The person doesn't hear you, they misinterpret something or whatever, and then you go on. So even our best interactions, the good interactions, are messy. And I think they're inherently messy. I don't think you can be really perfectly coordinated, but you repair them. And in getting that experience of repair with your partners and friends, you come to know that we can repair this together. We can get over some of the obstacles that come up and some of the messiness that gets into place. And then if something big happens, you've had all this experience with this person, and so you come into a bigger breakdown, some big argument that you had. Maybe it's a political argument these days. But you also know that you've been able to get along and repair, and you have hope about the interaction. And that gives you the capacity to repair even in the face of a bigger stress.
One quote of many in the book, The Power of Discord, that I really love is, quote, "Messiness holds the key to strong relationships," unquote. Can one of you talk about, and Dr. Tronick, you've touched on it a bit, you haven't called it this, but can one of you talk about the 70-30 rule in mismatch, especially as it relates to infant-parent interactions?
Well, the 70-30 was what we saw in our data on mother-infant interactions, that on average, about 30% of the time there was a matching, mother and infant doing the same thing together, say, a 4-month-old and a mother smiling together and gurgling back and forth with one another. And about 70% of the time, they were disconnected. They might not be looking at each other. One might be doing one thing, the mother is doing another thing. And that's an average. So some mother-infant pairs had higher rates of matching. Some had lower rates of matching. But in general, the interaction was a messy one. It was going back and forth between being coordinated and not being coordinated. And the key part of it was that there was this repair that went from the mismatching state back to the matching state. So going from, oh, I'm feeling disconnected, I'm feeling like something's a little bit wrong, and then I reconnect with you and I feel connected back to you, I feel positive about you, I gain a sense of agency that we can repair the mismatches that we experience.
Dr. Gold, what happens when babies experience mismatch but little opportunity for repair?
I think it can be really quite devastating. And this is where I love that phrase, going on being, because it's something so simple that, a baby has a sense that they exist because, especially a young infant, because their caregiver is there and the caregiver goes and comes back. And when the caregiver goes and the time to repair is beyond the baby's ability to tolerate, in the baby's mind, the mom doesn't exist anymore. And if the mom doesn't exist anymore, then the baby doesn't exist anymore. So this is a very, very profound kind of existential distress. And I think, we wrote a piece, and it's sort of integrated into the book in chapter 8 about when meanings go awry, like when you think about children separated at the border and really devastating situations like that it really is this annihilation of their very self, their very sense that who I am I. So it's very profound.
What happens when infants and children rely on continued connection to hold themselves together due to lack of opportunity to move through the process of mismatch and repair? In the book, there was a still face example of just that. I believe it was a 2-year-old, and it ended up being so disturbing that you had to stop the still face early. Can you describe that still face and what the implications of constant, continued pursuit of connection all the time? I guess, for lack of a better term, the helicopter mom.
This was an interaction in which, when it was a 2-year-old and the mother and daughter, and we had them playing together. And while I said there are not interactions that look like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, this was a remarkably synchronous interaction. The mother could finish the sentences, the little phrases that the girl was using, and the girl could finish what the mother was doing. And their playing with the toys was just, sort of perfectly attuned. But when we asked the mother to hold a still face, this little girl just came apart. She almost immediately was into that kind of distress and crying that maybe you see when you're doing vaccinations with little kids, where they lose their breath and they can't hold on. So we just terminated this right away. It was just a very extreme reaction. And when the mother started playing again with the little girl, they had trouble getting back together again. Whereas a typical 2-year-old reacts to the parent holding the still face, but they try to solicit the mother. They say, "Mom, why aren't you playing with me? Come on back, do this." And They do a whole bunch of things to elicit the mother. And when the mother comes back, they re-coordinate typically pretty quickly. So my interpretation of that was that this little girl with her mother had very little experience in repairing the messiness of interactions, that their coordination was such that there were very few moments where there was anything disconnected, a mismatch, anything stressful in the interaction going on. So their dance was so good, but as soon as they got out of step, the little girl had not had the experience of how to repair the interaction. She didn't have enough of that experience with the mother to overcome the stress that she was experiencing. And I think it was really frightening. Really frightening for this little girl to be disconnected.
Sounds like it was a little frightening for you as well.
Oh, it was. The only time I actually show that interaction, and it was a unique one, is in small workshops where we can really talk through the issue, because it has a very powerful effect on the people who are watching it. Whereas when I show the still face, there are people who react to that. But the typical mother-infant pair, when they get back together again, when they're allowed to repair the still face, they get back together again really quickly.
Tantrums, the bane of every parent's existence who has a toddler. Dr. Gold, why do they occur, and what advice do you have for parents in managing them?
Well, I think that tantrums are a great opportunity to see sort of the convergence of all the ideas that are in the book, because what they represent is a child who feels helpless, that they're in that transition where they realize they're sort of aware of their relative powerlessness, and they get frustrated, and in a situation where parents get that this is not a child being defiant or disruptive or all sorts of pejorative terms, but a child who's stressed, and they kind of let their child go through the tantrum, stay with them, help their child to feel safe, kind of breathe through it, and then get to the other side. There's this really wonderful moment of reconnection where there's a sense that they kind of, the parent was with them at their absolute worst and still was there with them and still loves them. And there's this kind of feeling of growth, because it's also extremely difficult for the parent. So the parent has a feeling of competence. So that's like an ideal way to navigate a tantrum. And it's certainly not always the way that it goes. But when I see families and tantrums are happening very frequently, to the point where it's completely disrupting the whole functioning of the family, then things are really out of whack and they're not having those chances to repair. And so we kind of we dissect out what happens moment to moment in the tantrum to try to get it to a place where they can move through that in a way that helps the relationship grow.
And Dr. Gold, how can our own childhood experiences influence our interpretation of a child's tantrum, or any other behavior for that matter? And how can our interpretations, or more accurately, our misinterpretations, affect mismatch repair?
Okay, well, that could be a whole several-hour discussion because it's very complicated. But just the first example that comes to mind is, I work with many parents who have had harsh discipline, physical discipline, or being shamed in some kind of way, and so when their child is having a meltdown, is in that kind of helpless state, they can experience that as kind of an assault, and even though, let's say, the child like slaps them across the face in the middle of their tantrum, it can create all the feelings that that person had when, let's say, their parents slapped them across the face. And so that can lead to all sorts of reactions that are not related to what's actually happening in the moment. And so, again, the process of sort of slowing it down in a safe environment where there's time to really listen to the story can help parents to become aware of those kinds of reactions that generally are out of awareness and can be so disruptive to relationships.
If you go back to the earlier question about the memory for the still face experiment, after 2 days, and actually we've seen it over a longer period of time. One way to think about that is during those first several years of life, these internal systems are being sculpted by experience. So you don't have, the 6-month-old doesn't have words for what's going on, doesn't have that bigger picture of what's going on in a situation. But nonetheless, their bodily systems, like the autonomic nervous system, are being sculpted, and the memories are being built into their body. And so the parent who then comes upon a situation, like a situation where the child is having a tantrum and the parent begins to get stressed, and then the parent no longer has all that cognitive ability to say, oh, this is okay, you'll be doing fine. I know you really don't want to be so upset. That what's happening there is that the parent, under a high level of stress, goes back into these primitive, more earlier developmental reactions to this situation. So in a sense, they begin to experience the fear and the stress along with the child, which of course, now you have two people, parent and child, both in states that are really highly problematic. And we may say the infant is having a tantrum, but at the same time, internally, the parent is probably having a tantrum, and they may even have a tantrum externally.
Dr. T here. I've been talking with Dr. Ed Tronick and Dr. Claudia Gold about their book, The Power of Discord. I've read it cover to cover, and I highly recommend it for anyone in really any kind of relationship, which pretty much means anyone, professionals and parents alike. We will pick this up later, and for now, Dr. Gold, Dr. Tronick, any parting thoughts for this episode?
I certainly enjoyed this, and the idea is, I think a key idea is to get over the idea that things have to be perfect in order for things over time, for relationships, for development of children to really move forward and to be really good. That in fact, the messiness allows for what we talked about in terms of hope, and the child gaining a sense of their own self, and for their trust in the relationship. And given the way most of us have enough messiness without really trying for it to make it work, and most of us are pretty good at doing the repairs. And we should be able to say what my wife and I say when we have our little mismatches, which, isn't it great? We're messing up. New things will come out of it.
Dr. Gold.
Yeah, I just want to say that I really appreciate you as a pediatrician having this conversation with us, because I think there's a lot in the culture of parenting and raising kids. There's a lot of expectation of perfection, a lot of advice, a lot of top-down authority. And if you can bring these ideas of supporting parents as the person who knows their child, and letting parents kind of off the hook that go ahead and mess up, because it's in the repair that you really support the healthy development of your child and your whole family. So I think it's a really important message to get out to parents and pediatricians. So I appreciate your doing that.
I hope you enjoyed my second conversation with Dr. Tronick and Dr. Gold. I'll just leave you with a few final thoughts. Just remember, in any relationship, a little bit of messiness, a little bit of discord, a little bit of mismatch, followed by repair, is critical in fostering growth and development in that relationship. In our next conversation, we'll talk about adverse child events and maternal depression. I'm Dr. Richard Allen Turner. I'll catch you on the flip side. Cut. Wes, cut.
Okay, I'm working on it.
Messiness is good. We're out.
Take 22.
Shut
right
up.
on the set.
Shut up. Everyone, I've been talking with Dr. Ed Tronick and Dr. Claudia Gold about their book, oh good Lord, The Power of Discord. Jeez. Okay, everyone.
Messiness is good.
Messiness is good. I was hoping, because I knew I was going to screw up at some point, and I was thinking, I hope they realize that messiness is good. So anyway,